This morning on Deer Dirt, we're going to take on the challenging question of whether you have too many deer. You can hear the trains down the valley. It's funny how the sound carries up and down this country because they're more than a mile away, but you can really hear them loud and clear. It's a beautiful morning, dew on the ground, dog rolling in the dew. But we do have a challenging question in place in front of us here. Do you have too many deer? How do you know? And if you do, what impact is it having? Why is that bad? And if it is bad, how do you get the numbers down? So we got some ground to cover. I think for practical purposes, you can say there's three different measurements or three different numbers you can look at, or three different tests to decide whether you have too many deer. The first one is whether you're seeing damage to the habitat. And that's a tricky one because, you know, not being foresters and biologists, most of us, we're not necessarily going to see the browse species that aren't here, that the deer have wiped out. So that's a tricky one. The obvious signs are going to be browse lines in the timber, where you've got, you know, everything from about, maybe 4 feet or a little bit higher than that on down is just trimmed all around all the openings, all through the timber. The deer have just eaten anything edible that they can reach. That's one sure sign that you have too many deer. And you have too many deer here because of the impact that they're having on the habitat, you know, eating stuff that's probably never going to come back again. And also the fact that when they're that hungry, they're not reaching their potential. They're not as healthy as they could be. That means the bucks aren't going to grow as big antlers. The does aren't going to be as healthy during the time when they're fawning. You know, so overall the herd is just, you know, they're just not doing as well. And that's the surest sign that you have too many deer. Another one is if your neighbor friends that are farmers are complaining. I call that the social carrying capacity. You know, the first one might be the actual carrying capacity that you've exceeded, but then there's also the social carrying capacity. The fact that, you know, you're just not fitting in, your herd isn't fitting in to the overall scheme of the neighborhood. It's impacting the livelihood of the farmers that are near you. And you may have tenant farmers on your property, or maybe you farm yourself, and you've seen it. You know when the impact is there, when the deer are taking, you know, even some part or some percentage of the crop. Farmers don't like that. You know, it costs them a lot of money to put the stuff in the ground. Last thing they want to see is for a deer to come along and eat it before they can harvest it. So keep that in mind. That's number two. Number three is one that's probably a little bit less commonly considered. That's the fact that you can have so many deer that hunting isn't challenging anymore. It's not maybe as much fun or as interesting or satisfying as what it was when there were less deer. That one doesn't happen for a lot of people, but you know, as you get older maybe, or you get, you know, past that point where you want to fill your wall with deer heads, you start coming back to that point and you start saying, gosh, when I was a kid, you know, hunting had a lot more challenge to me, and therefore it was more satisfying when I was successful. It's too easy now. It's not a question of whether or not I'm going to shoot something, it's just a question of what I'm going to shoot. You're not really hunting, you're more what I would call almost like shopping. Nope, not this one. Okay, I'll take this one. That's not the same. So there's three different tests, and that's the more practical way of looking at your deer herd. The more scientific way is to get an actual number, and that's what, if you're calling up a state biologist or a regional biologist or somebody like that that's associated with managing deer in your area, and you say, how do I know if I have too many deer? Well, they might say some of those things, but what they're really going to say is, we like to try to keep our herd around such and such deer per square mile of habitat. So, this farm is mostly habitat. So if I get the number of deer on this farm, that could be pretty easily equated to the number of deer per square mile of habitat. But some really open areas that don't have a lot of habitat, you might get 50 deer per square mile, but it might only be 20% habitat. Well, now you got to multiply that number by 5. Now you've got 250 deer per square mile of habitat. That's a whole different number. So that's another way to look at it, to ask the state experts, the local biologists, what number they recommend. So then you got to figure out what number you actually have. And that's really tricky. The Quality Deer Management Association has set up a scientific method where you can use trail cameras and establish what roughly the deer density and the buck to doe ratio is on your property, just by running cameras in certain locations at certain times for certain lengths of time. That can be fairly accurate. The best thing that I've found kind of caught me by surprise. This past spring, a fellow named Jack Houston came to my farm, and he flew a thermal drone. And he's got a business. He's just a young guy. I think he might even still be in college. But he's got a really cool business where he goes around and does this for people. It's Missouri Drone Deer Recovery, I think is what he calls it. But, I'm sure the recovery is some aspect of it, but boy, the bigger service is being able to tell people exactly how many deer they have on their property. And then you can figure out, okay, again, based on the percentage of that property that's open and the percentage that's, cover, you can determine the number of deer per square mile of cover. That number, it changes greatly depending on which part of the country you're in. Areas with a lot of food, with good soils, I call it a good range, places where it's easy for the deer to find food. That number could probably be somewhere between 50 and maybe at the very upper end 100 at the very most, probably 50 to 80 deer per square mile of cover in areas with really good range. Areas with a lot less food supplies, maybe no food plots, no ag fields nearby, that number might need to be, much lower, 20, maybe less than that in some areas, if there's just no food, if it's old growth timber. But again, I'm sure there's a local expert that can tell you what that number should be. That's going to be their idea. Usually they're pretty conservative in my experience. They generally will say, the ideal number is a fairly low one. So a lot of times you can bump that number up just a little bit and still do okay. But anyway, the point is there is a limit. You can hit a point where there's too many deer. So that's how you know if you have too many deer. From a practical standpoint, the habitat's just not going to be as good, and maybe you don't care. But that's certainly a consideration, because if you're trying to feed the deer and keep them healthy the year round, the habitat is going to carry the deer much more so than typical ag, because ag gets harvested and then it's gone. And even if you plant a lot of food plots, they're only going to sustain the deer for a part of their year and a percentage of their diet. You still need the habitat that they live in to produce a high percentage of what they eat. So the deer aren't going to be as healthy if there's just too many of them. The other thing that'll happen is they get what's called social stress. There have been a lot of research studies done on this, and I read a lot of them, and I've talked to a lot of biologists, but I can't quote them off the top of my head and all the numbers. But I do know that there's a certain point where even if there's plenty of food, as you pack more and more deer together, they start to feel stress. And anytime deer are stressed, they're not going to reach their potential. They're not at their healthiest. It's no different than, with people, and, doctors are always saying, if you got too much stress, it's bad for you. Well, same for the deer. They just don't get their stress in the same ways that we do. But those are some practical results. Again, like I said, the farmers in the area, they can be angry at you, and that's definitely a practical result. Yeah, you don't want that either. So how do you bring the herd down? And I've done it. I had a farm in southern Iowa for 18 years, and when I bought it, and it was in a really high deer density area, and when I bought it, I immediately set to shooting every doe that came past within bow range. And they had just changed the laws in southern Iowa at that time, or the regs, so that you could buy as many doe tags as you wanted to, up to a set county quota. And they weren't hitting the county quota, so basically, as long as I was willing to keep buying them, and they weren't super expensive, I could just keep shooting them. I shot every doe that came within bow range for about 5 years, and my neighbors were doing that too. They were shooting, everything that they could. During the late firearm seasons, with muzzleloaders, we could, go into some of the fields and some of the food plots and shoot a bunch of them. And so the result was that we dropped the herd substantially, but it took a massive effort. It was almost like you gave up the whole thought of buck hunting in favor of bringing your herd down. And not everybody's willing to do that, but that's the length that you need to go if you're trying to, to drop your numbers. I think the biologists have said in a good range, an area with, good reproduction, good survival rate of fawns, that you have to kill at least 25% to 30% of your adult deer every year in order to hold the population where it is. So if you're trying to drop the population, you figure you got to kill more than a third of your does every year. And that's a pretty big job, especially if you got a fair amount of land. If you got 100 acres, you might have to kill, well, you're going to need help from your neighbors too if you're going to do a really substantial job of dropping the herd numbers. But let's just say you've got 20 does on 100 acres. Now you've got to kill 10. That's a lot, and you can enjoy doing that, but think about the logistics of that. I mean, you gotta, not only do you shoot them and then you disturb, the rest of the deer when they run off, but you gotta come back again and you gotta recover them. You gotta do something with them, you gotta get them processed. There's just a lot of time and a lot of commitment involved in even just killing those 10. Fortunately, I've got neighbors that want them, and over the years, I've had, ways to, get rid of the extra does that I shot. But anyway, that's how you do it. There's no easier way, no magic that you can just push a button and the numbers are down. So that's the discussion here. Yeah, you can have too many deer. You definitely can, and some people do. And fortunately on this farm I don't yet, but if I'm not careful, I will. Even here, when Jack flew this, he came up with a density of about 65 deer per square mile, somewhere in that neighborhood. And that's pretty good. I'm pretty satisfied with that here. I'd like to hold it. I don't want it any lower, and I don't want it any higher. Somewhere in that neighborhood is about perfect for this type of habitat and range. So it can be done, but it's not easy, and you have to know where you're at to start with. So hopefully this gave you at least some food for thought. I know it's not an exciting topic maybe to consider, but it's a very responsible one. If you're a hunter, even if you're just hunting on permission, it's your responsibility to keep the herd in check, to keep it within these parameters. The carrying capacity of the land, the social carrying capacity, whatever limits you run into. So take it seriously, and like I said, hope I at least got you thinking about it. Well, I appreciate you joining me. I'll see you back here again in another week for the next episode of HuntStand's Deer Dirt.